A girl grew up with a bear. 12 years later, they reunite in the jungle. The village of Brookhaven rested at the edge of a vast and enigmatic jungle, where towering, gnarled trees stretched toward the sky, their emerald leaves forming a dense canopy that swayed and whispered with the wind. While most villagers regarded the jungle with a blend of fear and reverence, 12-year-old Emily, curious and wide-eyed, felt nothing but fascination. Unlike the other children, who found joy in skipping stones across the river or playing hide-and-seek in the open fields, Emily spent hours lingering near the jungle's edge, her imagination teeming with tales of hidden creatures and undiscovered wonders. She would often press her ear against tree trunks, listening intently, as if the forest might reveal its secrets to her. Her parents, Anna and James, had scolded her time and again, cautioning her about the dangers that lurked in the dense undergrowth. "The jungle is no place for a child," her mother would say firmly. "There are snakes, wild animals, things you don't understand. Stay close to the village." But Emily's adventurous spirit was not so easily restrained. She often slipped away, carrying only her trusty journal and a sharpened pencil, eager to document the mysteries she was certain awaited her. One such morning, as the crisp air carried the golden beams of the rising sun through the trees, Emily ventured farther than she ever had before. She had woken early, her heart stirred by a dream in which the jungle had called to her, its voice both urgent and kind. Stepping barefoot onto the dew-drenched grass, she pulled on her boots, each step leaving soft imprints in the earth. Before long, she reached a place she had only glimpsed from a distance, a tangled thicket of brambles, shielding a narrow trail that twisted deeper into the dense foliage. Her pulse quickened. Carefully, she pushed aside the thorny branches, each step a mix of exhilaration and trepidation. The deeper she ventured, the quieter the world became, until the only sounds remaining were the rustling leaves and her own measured breaths. Then she froze. A faint, plaintive sound reached her ears, something different from the rustling trees or the chirping birds. At first it was barely audible, but as she strained to listen, it grew clearer, a weak, high-pitched whimper. Her heart pounded. What could it be? She followed the sound, her steps growing quicker, until she stumbled into a small clearing, bathed in dappled sunlight. Beneath the shade of a sprawling tree lay a tiny bear cub. His muddy brown fur was tangled and unkempt, his ribs faintly visible beneath his frail frame, and his small body quivered as he let out another feeble cry. Emily held her breath, frozen in place. She had read about bears in her books, had listened to stories of their strength and ferocity. Yet now, faced with one so small and vulnerable, all she could feel was an overwhelming urge to help. But this cub was no fearsome creature. He was alone, vulnerable, and in desperate need of help. Her instinct to help overpowered any hesitation. Moving slowly, she crouched down, her voice soft and soothing. "Hey, little guy," she whispered, inching closer. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The cub's dark, round eyes met hers, filled with both fear and a faint glimmer of trust. Emily reached out a hand, stopping just short of his nose to let him sniff. He didn't retreat, but didn't move closer either. Instead, he let out another pitiful whine. Carefully, Emily shrugged off her sweater and laid it gently over his trembling body. The cub flinched at first, but then seemed to settle, his shivering easing slightly. "You're so small," she murmured. "Where's your mama?" But as her eyes scanned the surrounding forest, she saw no sign of another bear, only the quiet stillness of the jungle. Deciding she couldn't leave him there, Emily scooped the cub into her arms. He was surprisingly light, his fragile form pressing against her chest as his head rested against her shoulder. She knew she had to get him back to the village, even if her parents would be furious. They didn't understand the jungle the way she did. They didn't see its beauty, its hidden kindness. Holding the cub close, she retraced her steps, her heart racing not with fear, but with determination. When she emerged from the jungle into the open fields near the village, the sunlight seemed brighter, sharper, and she felt the weight of what she had done settle on her shoulders. At home, her parents' reaction was exactly as she had expected. Anna gasped when she saw the cub in Emily's arms, her hands flying to her mouth. "Emily, what on earth have you brought home?" she exclaimed. James, his expression dark with worry, quickly ushered them inside. You know how dangerous bears can be? He scolded. Even cubs grow into something we can't control. But Emily refused to back down, her arms wrapped protectively around the little bear. He's just a baby, she argued, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. He was all alone. He would have died if I left him there. Despite their initial protests, her parents couldn't ignore the cub's fragile state. Anna fetched an old blanket to wrap him in, while James reluctantly prepared a small bowl of milk. The cub, whom Emily quickly decided to name Buddy, lapped at the milk with a desperate hunger that melted even James's stern expression. For the first time, Emily saw a flicker of understanding in her father's eyes, though he masked it with a warning. This can't be permanent, he said. Wild animals belong in the wild. You'll have to let him go someday. Emily didn't respond, focusing instead on Buddy, who was now curled up on the blanket, his tiny body rising and falling in steady breaths. She knew her father was right, but the thought of parting with Buddy was unbearable. For now, she was determined to care for him, to give him the chance he deserved. That night, as the village slept and the jungle whispered in the distance, Emily lay awake, her thoughts consumed by the little bear who had already carved a place in her heart. Buddy's soft breaths filled the room, a gentle reminder of the life she had saved. Emily didn't know what the future held, but she vowed to protect him, no matter the cost. The days that followed Buddy's arrival were unlike any Emily had ever known. Her once quiet, predictable life in Brookhaven transformed into something vibrant and new, filled with the small, endearing sounds of the bear cub, who now shared her world. From the moment the sun broke over the horizon, its golden rays slipping through the cracks of the barn's wooden walls, Emily was by Buddy's side. He would stretch and yawn, his tiny paws reaching out as if grasping at invisible threads of light, and Emily's heart swelled with affection at every clumsy movement. Buddy's trust in her grew quickly, his initial wariness giving way to a bond that felt as natural as breathing. Each day, Emily would bring him bowls of milk, softened bread, and bits of fruit she had carefully saved from her own meals, watching with a mixture of joy and curiosity as he devoured every morsel with gusto. His strength returned bit by bit, and with it came a playful energy that brightened the barn and, in turn, Emily's spirit. Her parents remained uneasy about Buddy, their words often laced with caution, though they couldn't deny the change they saw in their daughter. Emily had always been spirited, her sense of wonder shining brightly, but now there was a steadiness to her, a responsibility that had brought a subtle maturity to her youthful enthusiasm. James, despite his lingering concerns, would linger in the doorway of the barn longer than he admitted, his stern face softening ever so slightly when he thought no one was looking. Anna, too, found herself sneaking glances at Buddy, who had a way of curling up in the hay, with such innocence that it was impossible to see him as a threat. "He's growing fast," Anna noted one evening, as she watched Emily coax Buddy into chasing a ball of yarn she'd brought from the house. "Are you ready for what that means?" Emily paused, the yarn trailing from her hands as Buddy pounced on it, his little claws catching the thread. "I know," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet resolve that surprised her mother. "But he needs me right now, and I need him too." As the weeks passed, Buddy's playful antics became a source of delight and occasionally chaos. He would stumble after butterflies in the field behind the barn, his short legs scrambling to keep up, only to tumble head over heels into the tall grass. Emily would laugh, rushing to his side to brush him off, her voice full of encouragement. "You'll catch one someday, Buddy," she'd say, ruffling the fur between his ears. He would huff in response, his small nose twitching as he gazed after the fluttering insects with determined eyes. But Buddy wasn't always content to stay in the fields or the barn. His curiosity led him to explore the edges of the village, his nose often sniffing at scents carried on the wind. And it wasn't long before some of the villagers took notice. It began with whispers, wary glances exchanged over garden fences. A bear, even a small one, was not a sight many welcomed so close to their homes. One afternoon, while Emily was fetching water from the well, she overheard Mrs. Carter, a neighbor known for her sharp tongue, speaking to another villager. "It's only a matter of time before that cub becomes a problem," she said, her voice low but pointed. "Mark my words, wild animals don't belong near people. It's dangerous." Emily felt a pang of defensiveness rise in her chest, her grip tightening on the wooden handle of the bucket. She wanted to march over and explain, to tell them how gentle and loving Buddy was, how he had no interest in harming anyone. But she held her tongue, knowing that words alone wouldn't change their minds. Instead, she focused her energy on proving them wrong. She kept Buddy closer to the barn, ensuring he stayed out of sight as much as possible, and she began training him in small, careful ways. She taught him to sit and stay, using bits of fruit as rewards, and her patience paid off. Buddy's intelligence shone through, and his willingness to please made the process surprisingly smooth. Despite her efforts, the tension in the village didn't go unnoticed by her parents. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, James spoke up, his tone serious. "Emily, you know we've supported you as best we can, but the village is growing uneasy. We have to think about what's best for everyone, including Buddy." Emily set down her fork, her appetite vanishing under the weight of his words. "I've been careful," she said, her voice steady but strained. "Buddy hasn't hurt anyone. He's not like the bears people are afraid of." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know that, but not everyone sees it the way you do. They only see what he might become, and one day you'll have to see it too." Emily's heart ached at the thought, but she refused to let it dampen her resolve. That night, as the village settled into quiet slumber, she sat in the barn beside Buddy, her fingers stroking his soft fur. His dark eyes, so full of trust, looked up at her, and she felt a fierce determination well up inside her. "We'll figure this out, Buddy," she whispered. "I won't let anyone take you away from me." Buddy let out a small, contented grunt, nuzzling closer to her side as if to offer his own silent promise. Their bond only deepened in the days that followed. Emily spent hours researching bears, borrowing books from the school's small library, and peppering Mr. Harris, the local ranger, with questions whenever she saw him in town. He was a grizzled man with a kind smile, and though he raised an eyebrow at her sudden interest, he answered her questions with patience. It was during one of these conversations that Mr. Harris told Emily something that struck a chord. "Bears aren't meant to live with people," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "They're incredible creatures, but they belong in the wild. It's where they thrive." Emily nodded, though the words stung. Deep down, she knew he was right, but the thought of letting Buddy go felt impossible. How could she send him back into a world where he had been abandoned and left to fend for himself? That night, as she lay in bed, her thoughts swirled with uncertainty. Buddy's soft snores from the barn drifted through the open window, a reminder of the life she had saved and the responsibility she now carried. She didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. Buddy had changed her life in ways she hadn't expected, and she wasn't ready to give up on him just yet. As the months passed, Buddy grew stronger, larger, and undeniably more bear-like. His once clumsy movements transformed into a steady confidence, his playful tumbles into deliberate explorations. Emily could see the changes every day in the way his fur grew thick and sleek, in the way his paws left deeper impressions in the soft earth behind the barn. His appetite, too, had grown. Where once a small bowl of milk and a piece of fruit were enough to satisfy him, now it seemed as though he could devour an entire orchard if given the chance. But even as Buddy grew, the bond between him and Emily remained unshaken. She spent every moment she could spare by his side, teaching him tricks, scratching behind his ears, or simply sitting with him in the barn, her head resting against his broadening shoulder as they both enjoyed the quiet sounds of the evening. Despite the joy Buddy brought her, the unease of the villagers continued to grow. Whispers turned to pointed glances, and then to outright complaints. It wasn't long before a group of villagers, led by Mrs. Carter, appeared on the family's doorstep one afternoon. Emily had been in the barn brushing hay from Buddy's coat when she heard the sharp knock on the door. Pressing her ear to the barn's side wall, she listened as her father opened it, his deep voice carrying over the murmurs of the group. "What's the meaning of this?" James asked, his tone calm but firm. "It's about that bear, Mr. Blake," Mrs. Carter said, her voice sharp with indignation. "It's getting too big. It's dangerous to keep something like that so close to the village. What if it gets loose? What if it attacks someone? Emily's stomach tightened as she heard the words. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to burst out of the barn and defend Buddy, to tell them all how gentle he was, how he wouldn't hurt anyone. But something held her back. The realization that no matter what she said, their fear wouldn't be easily swayed. Buddy hasn't hurt anyone, James replied. He's well cared for, and we've taken every precaution to keep him away from the village. Mrs. Carter huffed. Precautions aren't enough. Wild animals belong in the wild, not in barns, not near children. If you won't do something about it, we will. Her words lingered in the air like a storm cloud, and though James managed to calm the group enough to send them home, Emily could feel the weight of their disapproval hanging heavy over her family. That evening, Emily sat cross-legged in the barn, her arms wrapped tightly around Buddy's neck. His warmth was a comfort, but her heart was heavy with worry. They don't understand you, she whispered into his fur. They're too scared to see how special you are. Buddy let out a low rumbling noise as if sensing her sadness, and nuzzled her gently. Emily smiled through her tears, stroking his thick coat. It's not your fault, she said. I just need to figure out how to show them. But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her mind. Could she really change their opinions? Could she protect Buddy from the fear and prejudice that seemed to follow him wherever he went? Over the next few days, Emily threw herself into finding a solution. She sought advice from Mr. Harris, hoping he might have some way to help. The ranger listened thoughtfully as she explained the villagers' concerns and her own determination to keep Buddy safe. It's a tricky situation, he admitted, scratching his beard. People fear what they don't understand, and a growing bear is hard to ignore. Have you thought about what's best for him, though? Not just now, but in the long run. Emily hesitated, her mind racing. I don't know, she said finally. I just know he needs me. I found him when he was alone, and I can't let him go back to that. Mr. Harris nodded, his expression kind but serious. You've done a good thing, Emily. You've given him a chance to survive. But bears don't stay cubs forever. He's going to need more space, more freedom, and as much as it hurts, that might mean letting him go. The words struck Emily like a blow, even though a part of her had known they were coming. She returned home that evening with a heavy heart, the weight of Mr. Harris's advice pressing down on her. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't stop thinking about Buddy's future. She pictured him as he was now, his playful eyes full of trust. And then, as he might become bigger, stronger, no longer fitting in the barn or the village's narrow view of what was safe. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks and she clenched her hands into fists. Not yet, she whispered into the dark. I'm not ready. The weeks that followed brought an uneasy peace. Emily did her best to keep Buddy out of sight, leading him to quieter parts of the forest for his exercises, and keeping him in the barn during the day when the villagers were most likely to be about. But even with her efforts, the strain on her family grew. Her father spent long hours trying to smooth things over with the neighbors, while her mother quietly fretted over what might happen if someone decided to take matters into their own hands. Emily felt the tension like a live wire, her heart aching with the knowledge that their quiet life had been upended because of her choice to save Buddy. Then one evening, everything came to a head. Emily was in the barn feeding Buddy when she heard shouting from the direction of the house. Her stomach dropped as she ran outside, finding a small crowd of villagers gathered, their faces lit by lanterns and anger. Mrs. Carter stood at the forefront, her voice rising above the murmurs. Enough is enough, she declared. We've given you time, but it's clear you're not going to do what needs to be done. That bear has to go. James stood firm in front of the door, his arms crossed. You're not driving us out of our own home, he said, his voice calm but resolute. Buddy has done nothing wrong. But the villagers were unconvinced, their fear boiling over into frustration. Emily clenched her fists, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way to defuse the situation. Before she could speak, a deep, low growl rumbled from the barn. The villagers froze, their eyes wide with alarm as Buddy stepped into the doorway, his dark silhouette illuminated by the lantern light. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Buddy's gaze swept over the crowd, his presence commanding and calm. Emily stepped forward, her hand resting on his shoulder. "He's not a monster," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "He's my friend, and if you'd just give him a chance, you'd see that too." The villagers murmured among themselves, unsure, but Mrs. Carter's scowl deepened. "Friend or not, he doesn't belong here," she said. Emily swallowed hard, her hand tightening on Buddy's fur. She could feel the weight of their judgment, but she refused to back down. "Then I'll prove it," she said. "I'll find a way to keep him safe, without hurting anyone else." Her words hung in the air, a quiet challenge that seemed to settle the crowd for the moment. Slowly, the villagers began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the night. Emily stood in the doorway of the barn, her heart pounding as Buddy leaned against her side, his quiet presence a reminder of why she couldn't give up. She didn't know how she would keep her promise, but one thing was certain: she would do whatever it took to protect him. The days after the confrontation blurred into a haze of tension and determination for Emily. Each sunrise brought new challenges, but also a deepening resolve in her heart. She awoke early each morning to tend to Buddy, brushing his coat and feeding him before leading him through the forest trails they had come to know so well. These trails, hidden and winding, had become their sanctuary. Beneath the canopy of leaves, Buddy could roam freely, unburdened by the fear and prejudice of the villagers. Yet even in these moments of peace, Emily couldn't shake the growing urgency pressing against her chest. She knew the fragile truce between her family and the villagers wouldn't hold forever, and each passing day brought Buddy closer to the size and strength that would make him impossible to hide. Her parents had grown quieter since the confrontation. Her father, normally a man of steady words and practical solutions, seemed torn between protecting his daughter's dream and maintaining peace with the village. Her mother, though softer in her approach, had begun leaving subtle hints in their conversations, gently urging Emily to think about what was best for Buddy in the long run. "He's not a cub anymore," Anna said one evening, her voice gentle as she watched Emily pour milk into Buddy's bowl. "I know how much you love him, sweetheart, but he's not meant to stay here forever. You've given him a chance to grow strong. Maybe it's time to think about where he truly belongs." Emily didn't respond, her focus fixed on Buddy as he lapped at the milk with contentment. Deep down, she knew her mother's words weren't wrong. Buddy wasn't the tiny, vulnerable creature she'd found in the jungle clearing. His shoulders had broadened, his paws now left deep prints in the forest soil, and his playful tumbles carried the weight of a young bear growing into his power. But the thought of letting him go felt like tearing a piece of her own heart away. He wasn't just a bear to her, he was her friend, her companion, and the only one who truly understood the part of her that felt at home in the wild. One afternoon, as Emily and Buddy wandered deeper into the jungle than ever before, she found herself drawn to a clearing she hadn't explored before. The sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the ground with patches of gold, and the air was alive with the hum of insects and the distant calls of birds. Buddy ambled ahead, his nose twitching as he investigated the scents around him. Emily watched him with a mixture of pride and sadness, marveling at how natural he looked here, how effortlessly he blended with the wilderness that seemed to welcome him. She sank down onto a fallen log, her hands absently tracing the grooves in the bark, and tried to imagine what life might be like if she let him go. Would he be safe? Would he find others of his kind? Or would he wander the jungle alone, missing her as much as she would miss him? Her thoughts were interrupted by a rustling in the underbrush. Buddy froze, his ears perking up as his dark eyes focused on the movement. Emily held her breath, her heart pounding as she scanned the trees. From the shadows emerged a pair of eyes, cautious but curious, followed by the sleek form of a young deer stepping into the clearing. Buddy tilted his head, his stance shifting from alert to intrigued as the deer sniffed the air, its gaze darting between Emily and the bear. For a moment, the two animals regarded each other in silence, a fragile understanding passing between them. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the deer turned and bounded back into the forest, its graceful form disappearing into the trees. Buddy let out a soft huff, his attention lingering on the spot where the deer had vanished before turning back to Emily. She smiled faintly, rising from the log and brushing dirt from her hands. "You belong here, don't you?" she said quietly, her voice tinged with bittersweet acceptance. Buddy padded over to her, his large frame dwarfing hers as he pressed his head gently against her side. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur as tears welled in her eyes. "I don't know how to say goodbye," she whispered, "but I think I'm starting to understand that I might have to." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the jungle came alive with the sounds of twilight, Emily made her way home with a heavy heart. Buddy trotted beside her, unaware of the storm of emotions swirling in her chest. When they reached the barn, Emily settled him into his corner with extra blankets and a treat of ripe berries, watching as he contentedly munched on them. She leaned against the barn door, her thoughts racing. If she were to let him go, it couldn't be abrupt. It would have to be somewhere safe, somewhere far from the village but rich with the resources he needed to thrive. The answer came to her the next morning, when Mr. Harris stopped by the house to check on her father's tools, which he had borrowed for trail maintenance. Emily seized the opportunity to ask him about sanctuaries in the region. The ranger's eyes narrowed thoughtfully as he considered her question. "There's a wildlife reserve about 20 miles west of here," he said. "It's protected land, good for bears, with plenty of food and space. They've even got rangers monitoring the area to keep poachers out." Emily's heart leapt at the thought, but it was quickly tempered by the realization of what it would mean. She would have to take Buddy there, leave him, and walk away. Still, the idea of a place where he could live freely, without the fear of the village turning against him, gave her a sense of fragile hope. Over the next few days, Emily prepared for the journey. She packed a small bag with supplies, water, dried fruit, and a handful of items to help Buddy settle into his new home. Her parents, though reluctant, supported her decision, recognizing the maturity and love driving her actions. The night before they were to leave, Emily sat with Buddy in the barn, her fingers weaving a simple bracelet from strands of green and gold thread she had found in her mother's sewing basket. When it was finished, she tied it loosely around Buddy's paw, a symbol of their bond. "So you'll always have something to remember me by," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Buddy seemed to understand, nuzzling her hand with a low, affectionate growl. The following morning, as the first light of dawn painted the sky in soft hues of pink and orange, Emily and Buddy set out on their journey. The path was long and winding, but Emily felt a strange sense of calm as they walked side by side. She knew this was the right thing to do, even if it was the hardest choice she had ever made. When they finally reached the edge of the reserve, Emily knelt down and wrapped her arms around Buddy one last time, tears streaming down her face. "I love you, Buddy," she whispered. "Be safe. Be happy." Buddy looked at her with those deep, trusting eyes, then turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving Emily standing at the edge of the wild, her heart full of love and loss. Years passed, and Emily's life became a reflection of the wildness that had once captivated her as a child. She had grown into a dedicated wildlife conservationist, her passion for the natural world leading her far beyond the boundaries of Brookhaven. Her work took her to distant forests and grasslands, places where the fragile balance of life depended on people like her to protect it. Yet no matter how far she traveled or how many creatures she helped, the jungle near Brookhaven always held a special place in her heart. It was there she had found her purpose, shaped by a bear cub named Buddy, who had taught her the meaning of love, trust, and sacrifice. Emily returned to Brookhaven one summer, her truck laden with supplies for a new project aimed at protecting the jungle from poachers. She had secured funding to establish a conservation program, one that would create patrols, educate the villagers, and build a sanctuary for animals in need. The village had changed over the years. Many of the old faces were gone, replaced by younger families who brought new energy to the small community. Even so, the whispers of her childhood lingered in the air, carried by the rustling leaves and the murmurs of the trees she had loved for so long. As she unloaded crates of equipment, she caught sight of Mr. Harris, still grizzled, but as steady as ever, walking toward her with his usual purposeful stride. "Back to save the world, are we?" he called out, his tone warm but teasing. Emily smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Just trying to do my part," she replied. Mr. Harris nodded approvingly. "It's good to see you, Emily. The jungle's been quiet without you. though I reckon it's better off for all you've done." His words carried a weight that made Emily pause. She looked toward the edge of the forest, where the dense trees beckoned her like old friends. "I've missed it," she admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if it misses me too." Mr. Harris chuckled softly. "Oh, I think it remembers you just fine." The following morning, Emily ventured into the jungle, her boots crunching softly against the undergrowth as she made her way toward familiar trails. The air was thick with the scent of earth and greenery, and the sounds of birds and insects created a symphony that wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. She carried a map of the area, marking spots where cameras and traps had been illegally placed by poachers. Her goal was simple: remove the traps, set up monitoring stations, and ensure the jungle remained a sanctuary for its wild inhabitants. But as she moved deeper into the forest, a strange sense of anticipation began to creep over her, as though the jungle itself were holding its breath. Hours passed, and Emily worked methodically, her hands swift and sure as she dismantled a crude snare hidden beneath a thicket. She had just finished marking the location on her map when a rustling sound caught her attention. She froze, her pulse quickening as she turned toward the noise. The trees seemed to hold their ground, their leaves trembling slightly in the breeze, but the underbrush quivered as something large moved through it. Emily rose slowly, her heart pounding, and reached for the binoculars hanging around her neck. Peering through them, she scanned the trees until her gaze locked onto a massive, shadowy figure emerging from the foliage. Gleaming in the sunlight, his powerful frame moving with an effortless grace. But it wasn't just his size or majesty that sent a shiver down her spine. It was his eyes. Deep, dark, and unmistakably familiar, they met hers with a calm intensity that made time seem to stand still. "Buddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but the name carried the weight of years of hope and longing. The bear paused, his head tilting slightly as though he recognized her voice. Emily's heart raced as she took a tentative step forward, her hands trembling at her sides. "It's me," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. "It's Emily." Buddy let out a low rumble, not of aggression but of acknowledgement, and took a step closer. The distance between them closed slowly, each movement her breath caught as the bear stepped into the clearing. He was enormous, his dark brown coat deliberate and full of unspoken understanding. When they were only a few feet apart, Emily dropped to her knees, her hand reaching out instinctively. Buddy leaned down, his massive head brushing against her outstretched palm, and Emily felt a sob rise in her throat. "You're still here," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I hoped you'd be okay, but I never thought—" The moment stretched between them, a reunion that needed no words. Buddy's presence was as steady and grounding as it had been all those years ago, but now it carried the weight of the life he had built in her absence. Emily noticed the small scars on his muzzle, the way his muscles moved beneath his thick fur, and she realized how strong he had become. He was no longer the fragile cub she had cradled in her arms, but a true guardian of the jungle, a force of nature in his own right. Their reunion was interrupted by the sound of distant voices. Emily tensed, recognizing the telltale shouts of poachers moving through the forest. Buddy's ears twitched, and he turned his massive head toward the noise, his posture shifting to one of alertness. Emily rose to her feet, her mind racing. "We have to stop them," she said, her voice firm. Buddy rumbled in agreement, his gaze steady as he waited for her lead. Together they moved through the jungle, their combined presence a formidable force. Emily's years of training guided her as she dismantled traps and tracked the poachers, while Buddy's keen senses kept them one step ahead. When they finally reached the poachers' camp, Emily felt a surge of determination. With Buddy by her side, she stepped forward, her voice carrying through the trees. "This jungle isn't yours to take," she called out, her tone unwavering. The poachers turned, their surprise evident as they took in the sight of the massive bear at her side. They hesitated, the weight of their weapons seeming suddenly insignificant against the raw power of the creature before them. Without a word, they began to retreat, their confidence crumbling under the combined force of Emily's resolve and Buddy's presence. As the poachers disappeared into the forest, Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Buddy let out a low, satisfied huff, and she turned to him with a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said softly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Buddy's eyes met hers, and in that moment, Emily knew their bond was as unbreakable as ever. In the days that followed, news of Emily's efforts spread through the village, and the jungle began to thrive under the protection of the new conservation program. Buddy became a symbol of the wild's resilience and the deep connections that could exist between humans and animals. As Emily stood at the edge of the forest one evening, watching the sun set over the trees, she felt a sense of peace. The jungle had given her so much: a purpose, a friend, and a legacy she would carry for the rest of her life. And as Buddy's silhouette appeared in the distance, his powerful frame merging with the shadows of the trees, Emily knew they would always be guardians of the wild, together in spirit if not in sight.